Of all the murders reckoned to have been personally ordered by the Russia's leader Vladimir Putin in the UK, one stands out from the rest because it blatantly points to the source of the crimes. In 2018, the Russia's military launched a chemical attack against Britain as part of an attempt to murder Sergei Skripal and his daughter. It succeeded in murdering a harmless British woman, Dawn Sturgis. Russian dissidents in exile had for years known only too well who had been murdering them, so the use of a Novichok nerve poison must have been a boast to the world of the Russian government's perpetration of these attacks. This was obviously some kind of declaration of war by Russia against Britain, especially when considering the 2006 nuclear contamination attack on London by Russia's government terrorists who were murdering Alexander Litvinenko. This means that until a peace is agreed, the UK is fully entitled to engage in any military activities against the Russian Federation that it chooses. It is no coincidence that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 continues to be resisted with the help of military supplies from Britain and its allies. That Britain hasn't launched any attack on Russian soil itself is presumably, in part, a recognition by the British that its war is against the Russian government and not against the Russian people. Mr. Putin and his admirers, both inside and outside Russia, have often repeated the propaganda lie to justify the invasion of Ukraine, that the eastward extension of the European Union and of countries joining NATO is a grave military threat to Russia. This is an absurd lie. If NATO or the European Union had the faintest territorial ambitions against Russia, they would have attacked in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Empire was disintegrating and the Russian economy collapsing under the pressure of economic mismanagement and excessive military spending. Also, in the many Eastern European countries that have been subjugated for decades by Russian communist tyranny, there was in those days a lot of bitter anger towards Russia, which could have been exploited by anyone invading Russia. None of this happened because neither NATO nor the EU have any wish to invade Russia or tyrannize its people. To say that the West would wait for Russia to massively expand and modernize its economy, its military capacity and military technology, and would only then attack Russia is utterly ridiculous. Putin and his yes-men blame anyone and everyone for the invasion of Ukraine, except for those who are actually responsible, namely Putin and his yes-men. There had been political tensions mainly in the east of Ukraine, between those who wanted Ukraine to be closer to Europe and those who wanted it to be closer to Russia. Of all the many possible solutions to these differences, the Russian government chose to make the problems far worse in order to smooth the road to war, using its standard methods of fake news, false flag terrorism, arming of extremists, conspiracy theories, and so on. Putin and his arse-lickers claim that Ukraine had become Nazi, but the national support for the far right in Ukraine never reached 3%, so it's hard to see why the Russian military would do to Ukraine what Nazi Germany had done to Ukraine and Russia 80 years earlier, even stealing children. The political thinking of many old men degenerates deeper into authoritarianism, military aggression, and poor decision-making. A famous example of this is Adolf Hitler, who as he grew older increasingly believed himself to be a brilliant general, but made increasingly bad military and political decisions. It could be an indication of early dementia, and maybe that's what's happening in Russia now. What is certain is that those people who most strongly desire power are always the people who are least capable of using power wisely. Because most of us know that, they often pretend to be protectors of the people, even sometimes deluding themselves. Putin is often said to be a kind of Stalin, but that's a big exaggeration. The Georgian tyrant was the greatest traitor the Russian people have ever had to endure. He was in charge of the Soviet famine of the early 1930s, which he massively intensified to cause widespread starvation, topped up with many massacres, in order to force agricultural collectivization onto the farmers. Throughout his reign, Stalin converted what was supposed to be a single-class society into an economy based on slavery, namely the Zeks in the gulags with their high death rates. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in 1939, was officially a delaying tactic by Stalin to give him time to build up the Soviet military to be ready for the invasion by Nazi Germany written about by Hitler. In fact, Stalin slowed down the build-up of defences and did little to repair the disastrous consequences on the armed services of the Great Purge of 1936-38, which had taken the lives of most of its military experts. Stalin's Soviet Union also supplied Nazi Germany with immense quantities of strategic raw materials, such as oil and iron, without payment. The pact secretly carved up most of Eastern Europe between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. It's clear that Stalin's love for Adolf Hitler was far greater than his love for the Soviet people, at least until Hitler broke the treaty and invaded Russian imperial lands. By then, much of the damage from Stalin's treachery was done. Many millions died unnecessarily. Putin's betrayal of his own people is on a much smaller scale than Stalin's. There were, of course, the Russian apartment bombings by FSB agents early in his reign, and the resulting Chechen War, which won Putin the presidency he craved. Two of the typical consequences of this poor decision-making by the Russia's leader were the Moscow theatre siege and the Beslan school massacre. There were several other unnecessary small wars in and around Russia. Then, starting in 2022, was the huge war against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has claimed that Ukrainians are just a type of Russian and that their nationhood has no validity. If so, he has murdered an awful lot of Russian people in Ukraine and has made a lot of Russian people from elsewhere commit those murders and lose loads of their own lives doing so. Especially in the early parts of the war, a great many of the people persuaded in Russia itself to sign up for killing Ukrainians were young men, and they got little training and poor equipment, so many lost their lives. Younger generations are less likely to vote for Mr. Putin and his pet thugs than are older generations, so by arranging for huge numbers of young Russians to die in Ukraine, his share of the vote was cunningly increased. That was one of the few big successes for Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in this otherwise long and pointless war.